Dyer, 2:03 a.m. Arctic Circle. 14 kilometers above the Barents Sea, two Tupolev Tu-160 strategic bombers completed their turn onto the final ingress heading. Their navigation system showed 1,340 kilometers to the launch corridor. At cruise speed, that was approximately 78 minutes. Their transponders had been transmitting a civil aviation squawk code consistent with a scheduled Russian domestic freight flight since departing Olenya Air Base 4 hours and 19 minutes earlier. The squawk codes were a fiction. The cargo was not freight. Each Tu-160 carried 12 Kh-101 air-launched cruise missiles. The Kh-101 is a low-observable terrain-following cruise missile with a range exceeding 5,500 kilometers and a circular error probable assessed at approximately 5 to 10 meters. It flies at altitudes between 30 and 70 meters above terrain, conforming to ground elevation contours with sufficient precision to remain below the radar horizon of most ground-based early warning systems for the majority of its flight profile. It does not follow a ballistic arc. It does not produce an infrared launch signature that the space-based infrared system is optimized to detect. It appears to a radar system looking for it as a slow-moving return at low altitude, indistinguishable on a first pass from a flock of geese or a ground clutter anomaly. The target set for the 24 Kh-101 missiles being carried over the Barents Sea at 2:03 a.m. was not a military base, a carrier group, or a missile facility. The target set was the network of radar stations that form the backbone of NORAD's ballistic missile early warning system across Alaska and northern Canada. Specifically, the 4 large phased array radar installations at Clear Air Force Station in Alaska, Thule Air Base in Greenland, and the 2 distant early warning line successor stations at Cape Dyer and Brevoort Island in the Canadian Arctic. Rendering those 4 stations non-operational would not prevent the United States from detecting an intercontinental ballistic missile launch. The U.S. had space-based detection assets, sea-based radar, and alternative terrestrial sensors. What rendering those 4 stations non-operational would do was compress the warning timeline for a follow-on ballistic strike from approximately 26 minutes to between 8 and 11 minutes, depending on the launch point, and degrade the trajectory discrimination that allowed interceptors to be pre-assigned before a ballistic threat entered the terminal engagement envelope. The operation was not designed to enable a nuclear first move. The Russian security establishment had not authorized anything of that magnitude. The operation had been designed to answer a specific provocation. The U.S. announcement 17 days earlier of a bilateral agreement with Canada to upgrade the NORAD radar network with a new generation of over-the-horizon sensors that would, when complete, extend ballistic missile tracking coverage 400 kilometers deeper into Russian Arctic airspace. Moscow had assessed the upgrade not as a defensive measure but as a forward positioning of surveillance architecture that would, at full capability, eliminate the low-altitude ingress corridors that Russian strategic aviation had relied on for 4 decades. The operation was a message, targeted, calculated, bounded, designed to demonstrate that the existing radar infrastructure was vulnerable before the upgraded architecture was in place. Demonstrate the vulnerability, force a negotiation on the terms of the upgrade. The message had a price tag and a timeline. The price tag was 4 radar installations. The timeline was 1 night. The strategic logic was not irrational. It was, however, built on an assumption about NORAD's detection architecture that had been accurate for most of the preceding decade and had become inaccurate in the preceding 31 months. At 2:03:44 a.m., a Northrop Grumman E-8 Sea Joint Stars aircraft operating on a routine Arctic surveillance track at 41,000 feet above the Greenland Sea detected 2 large surface radar returns moving at 850 kilometers per hour on a southwesterly heading at 14,000 meters altitude. The returns were consistent with large aircraft. Their position was consistent with the Olenia Air Base departure track that had been logged as a domestic freight flight 4 hours earlier. The Joint STARS operator had two pieces of information available simultaneously. The radar return of two large aircraft where the filed flight plan showed one, and a southwesterly heading that did not correspond to the domestic destination logged in the flight plan. She flagged the discrepancy at 2:03:51 a.m., 7 seconds after detection. The flag reached the NORAD Operations Center at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado at 2:04:09 a.m. The NORAD duty controller's first action was to cross-reference the radar return against the Russian Air Force activity tracking system maintained at the Operations Center. The system showed the two Tu-160s as a matched pair to Olenia Air Base's departure log. Aircraft that had departed on a transponder code consistent with a civil flight and had been in the air for 4 hours and 23 minutes. The southwesterly heading and the altitude profile were not consistent with the filed destination. They were consistent with a strategic aviation penetration profile toward the North American Arctic approach corridor. The duty controller initiated the Alpha Vector Alert Protocol at 2:04:31 a.m., 22 seconds after the Joint STARS flag reached the Operations Center. Alpha Vector activated 3 simultaneous processes. First, an intercept order to the two F-22A alert aircraft at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, which had been at 15-minute ground alert since a routine Arctic readiness cycle had placed them in that posture 48 hours earlier. Second, an alert notification to the 4 BMEWS radar stations identifying the threat profile and requesting active scan confirmation of any low-altitude cruise missile signatures in the station's coverage sectors. Third, a notification to the National Command Authority Watch Officer and to Canadian NORAD at 22 Wing in North Bay, Ontario. The alert notification to the 4 radar stations was the critical action. What it produced within 40 seconds was the answer that changed the operational picture completely. Clear Air Force Station in Alaska reported at 2:05:09 a.m. that its AN/FPS-132 radar had been detecting intermittent low-altitude returns in the northern approach sector for the previous 11 minutes. Returns that the automated classification system had flagged as probable ground clutter at 3 separate instances and dismissed. The station's radar operator had not been satisfied with the clutter dismissal on the third flagging 7 minutes earlier because the return had maintained a consistent velocity and heading across 3 consecutive scan intervals in a way that ground clutter did not. He had initiated a manual track analysis at 2:04:51 a.m. while the Alpha Vector alert was still in transit to his station. When the Alpha Vector notification arrived 18 seconds later, he already had a preliminary track solution on 7 separate contacts, moving at between 185 and 210 meters per second, at altitudes of between 45 and 80 meters, on headings consistent with approach vectors toward the Clear station itself. 7 contacts, moving toward the radar that was tracking them. The KH-101 had been in flight for at least 11 minutes before detection. At 200 meters per second, 11 minutes represented approximately 132 kilometers of undetected approach. The closest contact was estimated at 94 kilometers from the Clear station perimeter. 94 kilometers. At 200 meters per second, that was approximately 8 minutes before impact. The NORAD Operations Center received Clear's preliminary track data at 2:05:14 a.m., simultaneously with the station's verbal alert. The duty controller had 8 minutes. The Alpha Vector Protocol's intercept timeline for F-22. Response from Elmendorf to the Clear sector was 14 to 17 minutes at full military power. The intercept would not arrive in time. The duty controller's next action was not the F-22 intercept. It was a direct call to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson's alert battery, a AN/TWQ-1 Avenger short-range air defense system that had been positioned at the Clear Air Force Station perimeter 9 months earlier. as part of a base defense upgrade that had proceeded quietly through the Air Force's installation security budget. The Avenger's Stinger missiles had a maximum effective range of approximately 5.5 kilometers and a ceiling of 3,800 meters. Against a KH-101 flying at 50 meters altitude and 200 meters per second, the Stinger engagement window was extremely narrow. The missile needed to be within the Stinger's range envelope for less than 28 seconds as it passed over the outer perimeter. The Avenger system was not designed as the primary defense for a strategic asset of Clear's importance. It was designed as a last layer, a capability added to a posture that assumed the outer detection and intercept layers would have handled the primary threat. At 2:03 a.m., the outer layers had 11 minutes. The Avenger had 8 minutes to prepare. The Clear Station's active defense team activated at 2:05:21 a.m. 2 Avenger vehicles moved to pre-designated firing positions on the station's northern perimeter. The thermal imaging systems on both vehicles acquired the first inbound contact at 2:12:04 a.m. A heat signature consistent with a cruise missile's turbojet exhaust at approximately 6.8 kilometers range, closing at 195 meters per second. The engagement solution computed in 3.4 seconds. Stinger launched at 2:12:07 a.m. The KH-101 was at 5,200 meters from the perimeter when the Stinger intercepted it at 2:12:09 a.m., 4.9 kilometers. Fragmentation debris impacted the tundra 4.2 kilometers north of the station boundary. The second contact appeared 34 seconds later. Stinger intercepted 4.7 kilometers. The third and fourth contacts arrived in a pair, 12 seconds apart, approach vectors from slightly different headings, designed to complicate the Avenger's engagement geometry by requiring it to slew its launcher between 2 separate track solutions faster than its mechanical traverse rate allowed. The first vehicle engaged the leftmost track. The second vehicle engaged the rightmost. Both intercepts succeeded. The fourth at 3.1 kilometers, the closest of the sequence, producing fragmentation debris that impacted 2.9 kilometers from the station's primary radar array. The fifth contact was the one the Avenger crews had been dreading since the engagement began. It came from the eastern sector, a direction that placed it behind the second vehicle's current launcher orientation after it had expended its forward sector Stinger engagement on the fourth contact. The vehicle commander began his traverse. The contact closed at 200 meters per second. The traverse completed at 2:14:44 a.m. The engagement solution required 2.8 seconds. The Stinger launched at 2:14:47 a.m. The contact was at 2.3 kilometers when the Stinger impacted it at 2:14:49 a.m., 2 seconds from minimum range. Fragmentation debris impacted 2.1 kilometers from the radar array. The array's outer access road was within the debris scatter zone. No structural damage to the array itself. The sixth contact was not intercepted. The Avenger vehicle that should have engaged it from the northern sector had expended its ready-load Stinger capacity on the first and third contacts and had not completed its reload cycle. The contact passed over the outer perimeter at 48 meters altitude at 2:15:02 a.m. and impacted the station's secondary power generation building at 2:15:09 a.m. The warhead detonated inside the building. Primary power generation, non-operational. The station's primary radar array shifted to backup power within 3 seconds. The backup power system was hardened, and in a separate hardened structure 180 meters from the power generation building. The radar remained operational at 87% output capacity on backup power. The seventh contact was acquired by a replenished Avenger vehicle at 4.1 kilometers and intercepted at 2:15:44 a.m. Debris impacted 3.8 kilometers north of the perimeter. The Clear Station radar array was undamaged. Of 7 inbound KH-101 contacts toward the Clear Station, 6 were intercepted by the Avenger defense layer. One impacted the secondary power generation facility. The primary radar was operational throughout, including during and after the single impact. The station was degraded, operating on backup power with a damaged support facility. But its core function, the detection and tracking of ballistic threats from the northern approach, remained intact. The picture at the three other BMEWS stations was less complete. The KH-101 packages targeting Thule Air Base in Greenland had been detected at 2:06:18 a.m. by a Danish Air Force F-16 conducting an unrelated maritime patrol that had happened to be transiting the approach corridor at 8,000 feet altitude. The pilot had observed the infrared signatures of two low-altitude cruise missiles passing below him at close range and had immediately transmitted a contact report. The F-16 had no air-to-surface engagement capability loaded for this mission. His report reached NORAD operations at 2:06:41 a.m. and triggered the same alert cascade that Clear's contact report had initiated 11 minutes later. Thule's own local defense posture was less developed than Clear's. The base had a perimeter security element but no dedicated short-range air defense system. NORAD operations immediately contacted the 21st Space Wing duty officer and authorized emergency dispersal of non-essential personnel from the radar facility's primary buildings. 5 of the 9 KH-101 contacts targeting Thule impacted within the base perimeter between 2:19 and 2:23 a.m. The radar installation itself was in a hardened structure that absorbed 2 near-miss impacts and sustained structural damage but remained operational at reduced output. 3 support buildings were rendered non-operational. The base was significantly degraded. At Cape Dyer and Brevoort Island, the 2 Canadian Arctic stations, the F-22s from Elmendorf, had been airborne since 2:06 a.m. They reached the Cape Dyer approach corridor at 2:21 a.m., 16 minutes into the engagement, and used their AN/APG-77 radar in low probability of intercept mode to acquire 6 of the 8 KH-101 contacts targeting that station. F-22 AMRAAMs are highly effective against cruise missiles. The AIM-120D's active radar seeker performs well against a small, low-altitude target. 4 of 6 acquired contacts were intercepted by AMRAAM between 2:22 and 2:24 a.m. 2 continued toward the station. The Cape Dyer installation's own perimeter defense, a recently upgraded system under a Canadian NORAD enhancement program that had been approved 2 years earlier, intercepted one of the 2 remaining contacts at 1.8 kilometers. The last contact impacted a communications relay building at 2:25:41 a.m. The relay building was rendered non-operational. The radar array was undamaged. The Brevoort Island station package was the only one where the F-22 intercept arrived with sufficient timeline for a clean engagement. The Brevoort approach corridor was 140 kilometers closer to Elmendorf's routing than Cape Dyer. The F-22s reached the Brevoort sector at 2:19 a.m. and acquired all 7 inbound contacts. 6 were intercepted by AMRAAM before entering the station's defensive perimeter. The 7th contact executed a programmed evasive jinking maneuver at 2:20:14 a.m. that placed it momentarily below the F-22's radar notch filter, a tactic that the KH-101 guidance system had been updated to perform against airborne intercept geometries. The contact dropped from 55 meters altitude to 22 meters for 4.1 seconds, then climbed back to 60 meters. The AMRAAM had already been launched. It reacquired the contact as it climbed and intercepted it at 2:20:19 a.m. at 3.4 kilometers from the Brevoort perimeter. All 7 Brevoort contacts neutralized. The station undamaged. By 2:26 a.m., the KH-101 engagement phase was complete across all 4 BMEWS stations. Clear. Operational on backup power, primary radar functional. Thule. Significantly degraded, radar functional at reduced capacity. Cape Dyer. Communications relay non-operational, radar functional. Brevoort, undamaged. The Tu-160 bombers that had launched the missiles were at 2:26 a.m. reversing course toward Russian airspace at maximum cruise speed. They had launched their full complement of 24 Kh-101 missiles, beginning at approximately 1:44 a.m. from a point over the Barents Sea. They had not crossed into NATO airspace at any point. International law did not provide a clear basis for engaging them in their launch position over international waters while they were not yet positively identified as the launch platform. The identification had come from the NORAD tracking system, not from a direct intercept engagement. The F-22s that had intercepted the Brevoort and Cape Dyer packages had been vectored back toward Elmendorf at 2:26 a.m. The Tu-160s would return to Olenja Air Base without kinetic engagement. Their mission had been completed. Its results were not what the planning had specified. NORAD Operations issued its preliminary damage assessment at 2:41 a.m. 4 BMEWS installations engaged. 2 operational without significant degradation. 1 operational with degradation. 1 significantly degraded. Early warning coverage of the northern approach corridor. Maintained at between 71% and 94% of nominal capability depending on sector. No station had been rendered non-operational. The warning timeline that the operation had been designed to compress from 26 minutes to 8 remained at 22 minutes in the most degraded sector. A reduction, but not the compression that would have changed the strategic calculus the operation was designed to effect. Time from first Tu-160 detection to completion of all Kh-101 engagements across 4 stations. 22 minutes 51 seconds. Kh-101 missiles launched, 24. Intercepted before reaching station perimeters, 14. Intercepted at station perimeter defense layers, 7. Reached intended targets and impacted, 3. BMEWS stations rendered non-operational, 0. BMEWS stations significantly degraded, 1. BMEWS stations with minor degradation, 1. BMEWS stations undamaged, 2. U.S. and Canadian personnel injuries, 4, none critical. F-22. AMRAAM expenditure, 10 missiles. Avenger Stinger expenditure, 11 missiles. Total interceptor ordnance cost, $23.7 million. NORAD early warning coverage retention, minimum 71% in most degraded sector. The operation had found the seam between what NORAD's outer detection architecture could see and what the inner defense layers could handle in the time available. At Clear, 11 minutes of undetected approach had reduced the engagement timeline to 8 minutes, a margin that the Avenger crew had worked within precisely at the cost of 1 secondary building and 1 expended reload cycle. At Thule, the absence of a dedicated short-range air defense layer had allowed 5 of 9 contacts to reach the installation. The lesson that Thule encoded was the same lesson that the entire engagement period encoded. The radar stations were defensible in the time available. They were defensible because the detection architecture was not limited to the stations themselves. The Russian planning cell that had designed the operation had built its timeline assumptions around the detection systems at the target stations. The idea that a radar system being targeted could not effectively detect what was targeting it. The assumption had been correct for 11 minutes at Clear, partially correct at Thule and incorrect at Cape Dyer and Brevoort. What the planning cell had not sufficiently weighted was the J-STAR's maritime patrol, the F-16 over Greenland, the NORAD network's cross-queuing architecture, and the base defense upgrade at Clear that had proceeded through the installation security budget without generating the signal's intelligence signature that a conventional air defense deployment would have produced. The BMEWS upgrade that the operation had been designed to pressure into negotiation proceeded on schedule. The first of the new over-the-horizon sensors reached operational testing status 11 months later. The Arctic approach corridor it covered extended 400 kilometers further than its predecessor. The message that 24 Kh-101 missiles had delivered across one Arctic night had not changed the program. What it had changed was the installation security posture at all 4 stations before the new sensors came online.